Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight in today, looking really closely at a specific verse, Acts 12:4, and this word Easter that pops up there.
Right. And our sources, they're drawing heavily on the teachings of Elder Michael Johnson, pastor, master Hebraist of biblical law, leader in Paleo Hebrew studies.
Exactly. And his perspective, reflected in what we've looked at, argues that this Easter mentioned isn't Passover. Not at all.
It suggests, actually, that it might point to a heathen influence, something possibly obscured in some of the newer Bible translations.
Which, if true, could really shift how we understand early followers of Christ's practices and, the whole idea of pure worship commanded by Jehovah.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us straight to the central question, doesn't it? When Acts 12:4 in the KJV uses Easter, is it just another way of saying Passover, or is it something else entirely?
Elder Johnson's work, as we see in the materials, lands firmly on something else.
Yes, and understanding why he argues that, well, it has pretty big implications for how we read Scripture and approach worship itself.
Okay, let's get into the verse itself then. Acts chapter 12, verse 4, King James Version.
Go ahead.
It says, "And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him intending after Easter, to bring him forth to the people."
Okay. 4 quaternions, that's 16 soldiers, basically. Roman guard detail.
Right. But the key phrase is after Easter. And Elder Johnson's argument, grounded in his understanding of biblical law and the original language context.
Is that this Easter is not Passover, it's a heathen festival.
So to understand why that distinction is so critical, we need to look at the law itself, right? How it lays out Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Precisely. You go to Leviticus chapter 23, verse 5. It's very clear. In the 14th day of the first month at even is Jehovah's Passover.
The 14th day, okay.
Then the very next verses, Leviticus 23, 6 and 7, continue. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Jehovah. 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread.
Ah, so the timing is sequential. It's locked in. Passover on the 14th.
At evening, yes.
And then the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts immediately on the 15th and runs for 7 days.
Correct. A clear, defined order. Passover first, then the 7 days of unleavened bread.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting when you look back at Acts, specifically the verse right before the one mentioning Easter, Acts 12:3.
Yes, what does that one say?
It says, talking about Herod Agrippa grabbing Peter, because he saw it please the followers of Christ, he proceeded further to take Peter, also founding. Then were the days of unleavened bread.
Okay, hold on. Then were the days of unleavened bread.
Exactly. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was already happening when Peter was arrested.
So if we follow the timeline from Leviticus, if unleavened bread starting the 15th was already underway,
Then Passover, which happens on the 14th.
must have already finished. It had to have passed.
Right. So the Easter, mentioned in the very next verse, verse 4, the time Herod was waiting for after arresting Peter during unleavened bread.
It simply cannot be Passover, according to this sequence. That's a core pillar of Elder Johnson's argument based on the text itself.
It lines up perfectly with the sequence in the law. Okay, so if it's not Passover, what is it? What's the argument for what this Easter actually refers to?
Well, the perspective from Elder Johnson, as presented in our sources, is that this refers to a Roman heathen festival, something Herod Agrippa I was observing.
Herod. Right, he was in a tricky position, wasn't he? Trying to please Rome, but also keep certain leaders among the Jews or followers of Christ happy.
Exactly, a political balancing act. And observing Roman customs, major Roman holidays, would likely have been part of that.
And the sources suggest this Easter might link to figures like Ishtar or Eostra, springtime festivals, that sort of thing.
Yes, those connections are often brought up. The idea is that Herod, wanting to maintain good relations, especially with his Roman superiors, might well have been observing a prominent Roman springtime festival, perhaps one related to those deities.
Which would be a classic example of, what's the term? Syncretism.
Syncretism, yes. Blending religious practices, mixing Jehovah's instructions with heathen traditions.
And this leads directly into another major point from Elder Johnson's teachings, a critique of modern Bible translations.
A very pointed critique. The sources highlight that many popular versions today, NIV, ESV, and others, they don't say Easter in Acts 12:4.
What do they say instead?
They replace it with Passover.
Wow. So they translate the Greek word Pascha directly as Passover there, even though the KJV translators chose Easter.
Correct. And the viewpoint rooted in Elder Johnson's work is that this isn't just, a simple translation choice. It's seen as a significant alteration.
An alteration that does what? Exactly, according to this view.
It obscures that distinction we just talked about. It blurs the line between Jehovah's appointed times, like Passover, and these other heathen festivals that might have been happening concurrently.
So it hides the potential syncretism Herod might have been involved in.
That's the argument. And they often point to warnings in Scripture itself, like Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2.
Which says not to add or subtract from Jehovah's commands.
Precisely. The concern is that changing that word Easter back to Passover in that specific context actually removes a piece of information conveyed in the KJV text.
Okay, that's a serious charge against those translations. It also makes me think about study tools. People often rely on things like Strong's Concordance.
Right, and Elder Johnson, based on our sources, offers a word of caution there too.
Not saying don't use them at all, but
But be careful about relying only on a general definition from a concordance or lexicon without deeply considering the specific context of the passage.
how so?
Well, the Greek word pascha usually means Passover, so if you just look it up in Strong's, you'll see Passover.
Ah, I see. So you might just plug that in without thinking about the timeline issue in Acts 12:3.
Exactly. The argument is that relying solely on the lexicon definition here, without looking at the surrounding verses and the timeline established in the law, can lead you to mistakenly equate the Easter in Acts 12:4 with Passover.
So the context is king. Elder Johnson emphasizes relying on the book itself, the biblical text in context.
Yes, he's quoted as saying something like, "All the answers are in the book. Explain it to me out of here." The emphasis is always back on Scripture, understood contextually.
Which brings us back to that danger you mentioned earlier, syncretism. Let's elaborate on why blending these things is seen as so problematic from this perspective.
According to Elder Johnson's teachings, mixing these distinct practices, Jehovah's commanded Passover, and a potentially heathen festival like the Easter in Acts 12:4 goes against fundamental biblical principles.
Principles of separation.
Yes. The idea of keeping worship pure and distinct from surrounding heathen influences. They point to passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 17.
The part about not being unequally yoked.
Yeah.
And coming out from among them and being separate.
That's the one. The argument is that conflating Passover and Easter, whether through translation or practice, violates this call for separation and risks mixing the holy with the profane, the clean with the unclean.
It's seen as compromising the integrity of true worship, as defined by Jehovah.
Absolutely. And this connects directly to commands found even in the Old Testament, like in Jeremiah.
Jeremiah chapter 10.
Verses 2 and 3. Learn not the way of the heathen, for the customs of the people are vain.
So the connection being made is, don't adopt or integrate the religious customs and holidays of the nations around you.
Yeah.
Keep Jehovah's ways distinct.
That's the essence of it. Applying that principle, Elder Johnson argues against adopting heathen holidays or trying to somehow Christianize them, suggesting we should stick solely to what Jehovah commanded.
And finally, tying this all together, the sources also touch on the deep spiritual meaning of Passover itself, which gets potentially obscured by this confusion.
Right, Passover isn't just a historical remembrance, it's rich with symbolism.
The Passover lamb.
Pointing directly to the salvation of Jehovah, as John the Baptist declared in John chapter 1, verse 29, "Behold the Lamb of Jehovah, which taketh away the sin of the world."
And the unleavened bread.
Symbolizing purification, putting away sin and hypocrisy, living in sincerity and truth, deep spiritual meanings.
So the concern is that if you blend Passover with a festival like Easter, which has completely different origins and associations.
You dilute or even lose sight of these specific Jehovah-ordained meanings. The unique significance of Passover gets muddied.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, the perspective we've explored today, heavily informed by Elder Michael Johnson's work on biblical law and Paleo Hebrew.
Based on the timeline in Leviticus, the context of Acts 12:3 saying unleavened bread was already happening, and considering Herod's likely political situation.
The conclusion presented is that Easter, in Acts 12:4, as found in the King James Version, refers to a distinct heathen festival, not the biblical Passover.
And flowing from that is a significant concern, voiced strongly by Elder Johnson, about modern translations that replace Easter with Passover in that verse.
Because doing so is seen as potentially blurring a crucial line.
A line between Jehovah's sacred appointments and heathen practices, potentially leading believers away from the purity of worship Jehovah commanded.
It definitely encourages a very careful reading of the text and a consideration of historical context, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Elder Johnson's work consistently pushes for that rigorous, context-aware approach to Scripture.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. A lot to think about regarding translation, context, and the separation of worship. Thanks for walking us through Elder Johnson's perspective on this complex issue.
Glad to discuss it. It certainly challenges common assumptions.
And for our listeners, perhaps a final thought to consider. How does maintaining, or perhaps failing to maintain, a clear distinction between Jehovah's appointed times and other traditions impact our understanding and practice today? What further questions does this raise for you about the early followers of Christ and their world? Something to ponder.
Today, we're taking a close look into the teachings of Elder Michael Johnson. He's a pastor, a master Hebraist of biblical law. And we're focusing specifically on his analysis of, well, two key terms in Scripture, Easter and Passover.
Right. We've gathered insights from his video discussions, mostly from YouTube excerpts where he really breaks this down.
And our aim here, for you listening, is to really unpack Elder Johnson's perspective on why this distinction matters and, what it implies for how we read the Bible.
Exactly. And the essential question he keeps coming back to, and what we'll dig into, is about Easter. In the King James Bible, specifically Acts chapter 12, verse 4.
Okay.
Is that word Easter actually referring to Passover, as many think? Or, as Elder Johnson suggests, is it something else entirely, maybe a distinct heathen observance?
Okay, yeah, let's zero in on that verse then, Acts 12:4.
Right, so if you have a King James Bible, Acts chapter 12, verse 4 reads, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people.
Intending after Easter. Okay.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. Elder Johnson, in his videos, he points out that, well, a lot of modern Bibles, even study aids like concordances, they tend to equate this Easter directly with Passover.
Right. They'll often have a footnote or just translate it as Passover.
Precisely. And Elder Johnson's argument is that this creates, well, it's an inaccurate link.
Yeah.
It potentially muddies the waters.
And I can see his concern there. If the terms aren't actually synonymous in this specific context, then swapping them could lead to maybe a misunderstanding of the timeline or the event itself.
That's exactly his point. It really highlights how precise wording can be vital in Scripture.
So to understand why he insists on this distinction, we probably need to look at the timing of Passover itself, right, according to Scripture.
Yes, absolutely. We need to go back to the law, Leviticus chapter 23, specifically verses 5 and 6.
Okay, Leviticus 23, 5 and 6.
It lays it out very clearly. Verse 5. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover.
14th day. Got it.
Then verse 6. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. Unto the Lord 7 days ye must eat unleavened bread.
So it's a clear sequence. Passover on the 14th, then immediately following on the 15th, the Feast of Unleavened Bread starts and runs for a whole week.
Exactly. One follows the other. Passover first, then the 7 days of unleavened bread. No overlap, no ambiguity in the law.
Okay, that sequence seems pretty straightforward. How does that connect back to Acts 12?
Well, this is where Elder Johnson really connects the dots. Remember, Acts 12:4 mentions Herod intending to wait until after Easter. Now look at the verse right before that, Acts chapter 12, verse 3. It says quite plainly, then were the days of unleavened bread.
Ah, okay. Then were the days of unleavened bread before Easter is mentioned in verse 4.
Exactly. So Elder Johnson's point is, if the days of unleavened bread were already happening when Peter was arrested.
Which started on the 15th.
Right. Then Passover, which happens before unleavened bread on the 14th.
Must have already passed.
Precisely. So the Easter that Herod was waiting to be over, mentioned in verse 4, logically could not have been Passover, because Passover was already finished according to the timeline established right there in verse 3 and confirmed by the law in Leviticus.
Yeah, that timing argument is quite compelling when you lay it out like that. Verse 3 says unleavened bread is happening. Verse 4 says wait till after Easter if unleavened bread follows Passover.
Then Easter can't be Passover in this specific context.
Yeah.
The timing just doesn't work according to Scripture itself.
So if Elder Johnson argues it isn't Passover, what does he suggest Easter refers to in Acts 12:4?
Well, drawing from his research, including what's shared in the House of the Lost Sheep of Israel videos, he proposes that this Easter refers to a heathen festival.
A heathen festival? Like what?
He suggests possible links to, ancient Babylonian spring celebrations, maybe related to Ishtar or similar figures, which were often observed around that time of year in the Roman world.
And the source videos mentioned something about heathens running their holidays concurrently with Jehovah's holy days.
Yes, that point is made, that it wasn't unusual in that era for various cultures to have their own festivals happening around the same time as the feasts ordained by Jehovah. So you could have Passover and unleavened bread occurring according to the law.
And simultaneously, there might be this other separate spring festival known then as Easter or something similar being observed by others in the region.
Exactly, and Elder Johnson is very firm on this. Passover is a Jehovah-ordained appointment commanded in the law. This Easter, in Acts 12:4, in his view represents something entirely different, an external heathen tradition.
Which naturally brings us to his concerns about Bible translations then.
Yes, it does. He expresses quite a bit of concern in his videos about modern translations that replace the word Easter in Acts 12:4 with Passover.
He sees that as problematic.
Very much so. He views it as potentially altering Jehovah's word. He often brings up Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 2.
Which says,
Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you.
so for him, changing Easter to Passover is, in a sense, diminishing or altering what was originally written and preserved.
That's his perspective. He believes the King James translators understood the distinction in that specific context, using Easter deliberately, perhaps because the Greek word Pascha, while usually meaning Passover, here referred to the time frame around the Passover season, which also included this heathen observance. He feels later translations lost that nuance.
Interesting. So it's not just about the word itself, but the translator's understanding of the context back then.
Precisely. And this is also why he cautions against relying solely on, say, Strong's Concordance, if it simply lists Passover as the meaning for the Greek word used there.
Because the context overrides a simple dictionary definition.
That's his argument. He stresses that the immediate context, Acts 12, verse 3, setting the scene during unleavened bread, combined with the clear timing from the law in Leviticus 23, is far more critical for understanding Acts 12:4 than just a lexical definition that might suggest Pascha always means Passover.
So, seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read, as he says. Let Scripture interpret Scripture first.
Exactly. Don't let an external tool override the clarity found within the text itself, especially regarding the timeline.
And underlying all this textual analysis, there seems to be a deeper spiritual concern for Elder Johnson.
I believe so. Although the video excerpts don't detail it extensively, you get a strong sense that he believes confusing or conflating Jehovah's set-apart feasts with heathen celebrations isn't spiritually neutral. It potentially dilutes or corrupts pure worship.
It implies a need to maintain clear distinctions between what is ordained by Jehovah and what originates from other human or heathen traditions.
Right. It speaks to maintaining purity and observance.
And this all circles back to his call for critical thinking for people to examine this for themselves.
Absolutely. He directly challenges listeners. Don't just take someone else's word for it, especially if an interpretation seems to contradict the clear timeline presented in Scripture itself.
Like comparing Leviticus 23 with Acts 12:3 and 4 side by side.
Yes, he actually suggests that as a practical step. Show someone Leviticus 23:5 and 6, then show them Acts 12:3 and 4, and ask them, if Easter, in verse 4 means Passover, how does that fit with verse 3, stating the days of unleavened bread were already happening?
It forces you to confront the timeline directly.
It does. It encourages active engagement with the text, not passive acceptance. Are we, really reading carefully, paying attention to these details, or just skimming past?
Okay, so let's try to summarize Elder Johnson's position based on our discussion and the sources.
Go ahead.
His core argument is that Easter, in Acts 12:4, the King James Bible, does not mean Passover.
Correct.
Instead, he believes it refers to a distinct heathen festival, and his evidence is primarily the scriptural timeline.
Yes, the timeline established by comparing Leviticus 23:5 and 6, Passover on the 14th, unleavened bread starting the 15th, with Acts 12:3, which states the days of unleavened bread were already underway before Herod planned to act after Easter in verse 4.
Therefore, Passover must have already finished, making Easter in that verse something else.
That's the crux of it. For him, understanding this contextual timing is absolutely essential for accurate biblical interpretation in this instance. It challenges the simple equation of Easter and Passover here.
It definitely highlights the importance of careful contextual reading, not just reading words, but understanding the sequence and setting.
It really does.
So as we wrap up, maybe a thought for our listeners to consider building on this.
Yeah, perhaps think about this in your own study. How important is it to recognize and maintain the distinctions between practices ordained by Jehovah in Scripture and other traditions or celebrations that might exist alongside them, even if they occur around the same time?
That's a great point. We definitely encourage everyone to, as Elder Johnson suggests, go back and read Leviticus 23 and Acts 12 carefully for yourselves. Look at the timing, look at the terms used. What conclusion do you draw when you examine the evidence in the text itself?
A valuable exercise.
Indeed. Well, thank you for walking us through Elder Michael Johnson's perspective on this really intricate point of Scripture. It's certainly given us a lot to think about.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating study.
And thank you all